Start.
One of the things that causes the greatest consternation for boards is how do they handle conflicts of interest. You'd think it would be simple, but it isn't. A conflict of interest, under the definition in the Australian Corporations Act, is anything in which a director has a personal interest and yet is deciding upon on behalf of the board or company. So even if your interests are aligned, for example, you might be a shareholder and deciding on a strategy for how the company is going to grow, your shareholding, whilst it is an alignment, is still a conflict of interest because it is of interest to you as a person rather than of dispassionate interest to you as a director. Now, it's often said, no conflict, no interest. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that saying. You do not want a boardroom full of people who have absolutely nothing to gain or lose if the company succeeds or fails. That would probably not lead to the best company performance. So managing conflicts of interest is really important because you want directors who are conflicted. Getting that healthy tension between director interest and company performance is an art as much as it is a skill. So let's have a think about, firstly, what does the law say and where does it come from? Well, the law says in section 180 and 181 that directors must make decisions when they are free from material personal interests and always for a proper purpose and in the best interests of the company. Now, the best interests of the company might not necessarily be the greatest level of profit. There's always a good balance to be struck between levels of investment, levels of growth, levels of dividend payout, levels of salary paid. Do you want to retain and attract the best staff? Do you want to reduce overheads? These are decisions that directors need to grapple with. And you always want directors who have a very strong and keen interest in the outcomes, but not who are driven by their own personal outcome at the cost of the outcomes for the company itself. A lot of people think that companies exist for their shareholders. They don't. When you are a director, your duty is to serve the best interests of the company as a separate legal entity. It is not to serve the best interests of the shareholders. Shareholder interests can differ and diverge. Different shareholders might have different investment outcomes that they are seeking. They might have different horizons in terms of time. They might have different appetites for levels of risk. So as a director, you need to consider those things. You need to deliver sufficient value to your shareholders to retain their support, but you always need to be doing it with the best interests of the company firmly as the overriding consideration. It's really important as a director that your company has a good policy for how it will handle conflicts of interest. Now, there are numerous model policies on the internet that you can just grab and download and use. Or if you are going through a complicated process, for example, a listing or a merger or a demerger, you might find that your law firm can give you a very good sample policy. Notice that it's a sample. Samples are there to give you an idea. They are not there for you to take and consider as fit for your purpose. Remember, one size fits all, fits absolutely nobody unless you tailor it. So have a policy, make sure that that policy reflects your company, your desired outcomes, the sorts of conflicts that you expect to arise, and the ways in which you believe, in the best interest of the company, it would be most appropriate to handle those conflicts. Once you've got a policy, then you need to make sure that your conflicts are appropriately defined and appropriately disclosed. Having a large number of conflicts disclosed on your register is not a sign of a bad board. It is a sign of a diligent and detail-focused board. The two are quite different. So, encouraging directors to state what their potential conflicts are. Under the Corporations Act in Australia, a potential or a perceived conflict of interest is still considered as a conflict of interest, even if it doesn't actually exist or doesn't exist yet. So you need to think quite widely and broadly about what conflicts of interest might apply or might be perceived to apply or might apply in the future. Get your directors into the habit of feeling comfortable with thinking deeply and disclosing widely. You should also undertake a quick process at the beginning of each board meeting, because matters can arise in between board meetings, and you probably want to know whether or not somebody's conflicts have changed between the time they made their standing declaration and the time of the board meeting. So it's customary for the chair to ask, have all of the directors considered the conflicts of interest, and do they have any changes to their declarations in consideration of the items on the agenda for this meeting? And at that point, people can feel free to say, well, actually, I've now got a very close personal friend who works for this company and we're looking at doing a transaction with them. Or my wife has just bought shares in Telstra and we're looking at renewing our telecoms contract. So you need to think through. Things change, that's not a bad sign. It's only a bad sign if your delegations don't change with them. Once you've got your delegations, then you need to decide, how am I going to handle these? And this is where common sense starts to raise its head, or at least I hope it does. Because there are some conflicts where you go, well, as long as we know that your wife has got shares in Telstra, do we really think it's going to make you vote for a telecoms contract that doesn't make sense for this company? Is our business enough to impact the value of your wife's shares to the point that you would compromise your integrity? Probably not. So we'll just note it and carry on. However, if you'd put your entire superannuation into Telstra and we were in fact the Department of Defence or somebody who had an enormous interaction with its telecommunications service providers, then maybe we wouldn't just take that on notice. Maybe we would ask you not to become involved in the decision. If you were on the board of Optus and we were thinking about a major contract with Telstra, maybe we would go even further than asking you not to be involved in the decision and to step out of the room and say, look, you really should not access the materials. You should not know the details of that contract. So again, think through the specifics of each case. Just as every law case in the courts is won or lost on its precise specifics, so is every conflict of interest handled in the real world in boardrooms. Then you need to be sure that whatever you have decided is what you do. Law courts take a very dim view of directors who breach their own policies, processes, and procedures. It's just, dare I say it, a really bad look. So make sure that you do what you say you will do. Document that you have done it. The minutes should reflect any declarations of interests, and they should also reflect how they were handled. It's particularly important for the minutes to note who left the room and who returned to the room and at what times, so that if you are ever called upon to justify your course of action, you can. And you also need to think about those conflicts of interest that people just stumble into. A few years ago, the whole of Australia was really quite riveted with the first of the commissions of inquiry into Crown Resorts, and in particular with an independent director who, in an email to the major shareholder, had included a phrase, "I look forward to serving the interests of the shareholders and most importantly, you, Mr. Packer." That's a really clear indication that that director was not independent, but was instead thinking about serving the interests of the major shareholder. Now, 99.9% of the time, that would have been perfectly aligned with the interests of the company. But in that 0.1% of the time, when the interests of the shareholder are not the same as the interests of the company, that director needs to think very carefully about their level of involvement in the decisions and activities of that board. So think carefully, have a good policy, make good decisions, use your policy, document that you have applied your policy, make sure that people do not subvert the intent of the policy through their behaviour, especially if they think that informal behaviours such as emails are not going to be picked up. And if you really want to be operating at absolute best practice, from time to time, ask your auditor to review your policy, review your records, and just check that you are complying with your policy and that your policy complies with current best practice. Best practice evolves. That's the nature of best practice, is it keeps getting better all the time. So you want your conflict of interest policies to keep getting better all the time. And I really think if you follow those steps, you will succeed in managing your conflicts of interest and position your board and your directors as a board and as people of very high integrity, whom shareholders and other stakeholders will trust.
Great. And you had one more?
Yep, I did indeed.